The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in more places that could expose you more to identity theft. But LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, our US-based restoration specialists will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Don't face drained accounts, fraudulent loans, or financial losses alone. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
I had that dream again. My small business needs to hire, but I don't use LinkedIn, and I hire wrong. So our orders get all backed up. We're drowning in paperwork, then actually drowning, careless fighting off sharks with a stapler, and pirates are pillaging the office copier, and then I wake up.
Don't let hiring nightmares ruin your dreams. LinkedIn Jobs' new AI assistant goes beyond the resume, using unique insights to deliver a smarter shortlist. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/quality. Start hiring today with LinkedIn.
Hey, thanks for listening. This is Ross Kenyon. I'm the host of Reversing Climate Change, the podcast you are listening to right at this very moment. Before we get into the bulk of today's show, I'd love to tell you about our sponsors, Absolute Climate and Philip Lee, LLP. I've made great radio with both of them. They should be familiar to you if you listen to the show, but I want to tell you about why you should learn a little bit more. The first sponsor is Absolute Climate. I did a show with their founder, Peter Miner, a few months back, and a lot of people loved that show. I was asking a question of, can registries design their own methodologies for carbon markets without it being a conflict of interest? And Absolute Climate's thesis is no, they shouldn't be in the business of doing that. We actually need to disintegrate functionality within carbon markets even further. They are literally the only independent standards body for carbon removal that exists. Their name is very well chosen. I think they are some of the most aggressively idealistic people within carbon removal. It's come up on Reversing Climate Change so many times about how and why there's tension between commercial teams and science teams within carbon markets. There's some fundamental tension between the rules of running a business, or I should say, the rules of running a profitable business is maybe a better way to put that, and climate impact. And I think Absolute is one of those companies that, at least from my experience and what I know of them over there, I think they're going to be some of the staunchest holdouts, just trying to make sure that there can be a justified true belief that a ton purchased is a ton truly removed. They're betting big on not compromising. It's a bold strategy. I respect the absolute hell out of that. Absolute is very much doing things their own way, and they stand out to me, and I will never mistake them in a lineup. Go check them out. I really am endlessly fascinated by what they're doing. And that's also true of our other sponsor, Philip Lee, LLP. In fact, I told them to pitch me on some weirder legal shows. I really like doing shows about the law. I think the law is such a fascinating part of our shared social life. It structures so much of it. It's badly understood by most people. And just structuring deals within carbon removal is hard. I'm talking grown-up deals here. Like when you're trying to put together an enormous package, complicated structuring, a lot of money changing hands, the stakes are high. You really do need a good lawyer. I'm sorry to tell you that if you are a startup out there in carbon removal, you're going to probably pay a fair amount of money to lawyers. There's just no way around it. Your choice is basically, do you get a bad lawyer or a good lawyer? One really cool thing I can say on Philip Lee LLP's behalf, well, one, Ryan Covington and I did a very fun show about how basically no one except for an elite few really know what bankability and project finance even mean. And he lays it out very clearly. If you'd like to go listen to that show, it's awesome and it's linked in the show notes. And also we ended up talking about Ernest Hemingway a fair amount too. So it keeps with the tradition of reversing climate change. One also really cool thing is that they just won Environmental Finance's VCM Law Firm of the Year. They've won it 3 years in a row, 2023, 2024, and 2025. It's the only award for legal teams operating in the VCM, and they have offices in the US, Europe, and the UK. You should check out Philip Lee LLP. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to this, and thank you to our sponsors. You really make this so that it's something that in a busy life with lots of competing priorities, I'm able to keep coming back and making more reversing climate change. Thanks so much for what you do. And now, here is the show. Hey, Thank you so much for listening to Reversing Climate Change. I'm Ross Kenyon. I'm the host of the show, and I've been working in climate for almost a decade now. Today's show is about one of the central fights within environmentalism and really just some of the deepest philosophical questions that relate to climate change about what kind of lives should humans live? What kind of beings are we? What is the future we're pointing at? Is there a teleology, an endpoint towards which all development is pointed? And what does that mean for us? Usually the way this is framed comes from Charles C. Mann's The Wizard and the Prophet, that discusses the two main orientations within environmentalism. If you're a wizard, you're betting on the future. You think that technology is going to get better, human lives will improve. We might be creating problems with consumption or technology, but technology can solve those problems faster than it creates them. You're looking at that hockey stick of accelerating economic and technological growth over the past few centuries and projecting forwards and thinking about what will life look like several decades from now when our lives are easier, freer, more abundant, more prosperous. If you're a prophet, you look at the acceleration of technological growth and maybe have material concerns about it. That's a lot of stuff being made. Where's it all going? Where's it coming from? Or you might have a more spiritual inclination and wonder, are we actually better off? Are humans meant to live this way? Why are we doing this? And with this taxonomy for understanding environmental action, you'll see that it's wizards and prophets all the way down, essentially. It's everywhere. And you can see it in how people think about problems. If you've never identified as one or the other, you will probably now listen to what I just said and think, oh, I definitely like the wizard's position on technology, and I have faith that we are going to figure it out. And if you're a prophet, you're looking at the world and thinking that the direction that we are headed is not ideal. More technology cannot solve the problems that technology created. You might want to quote Audre Lorde at this point and say that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, or something like that. That's something a prophet might say in a context like this. However, you might have heard both of these and identified with each of them. When I had Charles C. Mann on to talk about The Wizard and the Prophet, which is definitely worth reading, as well as his book 1491 about the Americas before Columbus, great writing. His book does such a great job because it doesn't position one as the winner. It recognizes that there's a dialectic between the wizard and the prophet, and there are certain moments when the wizard might be ascendant culturally and vice versa. And it has a little bit of that yin-yang quality to it, where you know the image, you might have seen someone with a tattoo of it. As a kid, I remember like stick-on tattoos that would have that sort of like Taoist yin-yang thing. But in the white part of the circle, there would be a little bit of the black, and in the black part of the circle, there'd be a little bit of the white. And I think that's very true for the wizard-prophet dialectic here, that there's truth in both of these positions. There's a reason why none of them permanently wins over the other. It's because each of them exists in relation to one another, and keeping them in productive tension is really useful. Because there are pathological versions of both of these. The pathological version of the wizard is just the stereotypical tech bro. You got the North Face vest on. You're going to solve all of the world's problems. When the pie is growing enough, we never actually need to ask any hard questions about why society looks the way that it does. We can ignore all the deep-seated historical inequities, and we can just focus on technological development, and that will save us. I think actually the most extreme prophet orientation I've ever seen or come across, I think I got this originally from John Zerzan, who's a primitivist writer, and he argued that any type of symbolic language, any type of abstracted language that is using categories or types of language that get us away from what is immediately sensorially apprehended by us, and is using tenses that reflect ideas about time, about categories, things that abstract away from immediacy, are types of internal colonization of the technological world that is corrupting. Obviously, that position pens you in where you can no longer have a conversation about the world and its many peoples and its many inhabitants. And if you try to think without having concepts, generalizations, categories, very quickly you will feel that you can barely say anything at all. Can you even say this tree? Because tree is a category that presumes commonality across other tree-like entities, such that there can be a category of tree. What do you say if you have to treat things as much more unique that you have to give up the symbolic and the abstract? It would likely ground you so much more sensorially in the immediate environment in which you lived, but you could no longer address an audience outside of your very small community. And I think actually that's the intent. Primitivism is often located in small kinship networks and looks to a hunter-gatherer past under Dunbar's number, much fewer relationships, in many cases much smaller geographies, to the point where there are stories about, I think I got this from Jared Diamond doing anthropological work in Papua New Guinea, where groups of people would live in a single valley and there would be amazing linguistic diversity. In terms of miles traveled, hardly any. 15 miles away, there might be an unrelated language family within a community. And not only was that so different, but also it was considered not safe for various tribal members to cross over into the boundaries, even ones that were very close by, because that would be seen potentially as an act of war between these groups. So there's also some sense that having these protective barriers here might isolate us. And that might be actually how we're meant to live, is to not have a language that is so generalizable and so broad, to have so many concepts that essentially anyone can opt into it. Language is not meant to be a unifying social phenomenon, but an exclusionary one that is about difference, not about sameness. It is very difficult to explain that while also using the language that it's meant to undermine. It's a surreal thing, and I'm sure John Zerzan and others who think about questions like this have run into this numerous times. That's all to say that there's another wizard versus prophet fight right now. Very much of the moment, the discourse is calling me and I must go, to paraphrase John Muir. Everyone seemingly has read, is reading, intends to read, but hasn't yet read Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's new book, Abundance. And contemporaneous with that, Paul Kingsnorth, podcast alum, just put out a new collection of essays called Against the Machine on the Unmaking of Humanity. And these are perfect books to contrast. Abundance. If I had to choose a word synonymous with the wizard orientation, it would be abundance. Ezra and Derek in Abundance are talking about a world in which America used to build. But progressives, liberals, however we want to slice up the taxonomy here, as a result of Ralph Nader and the legalistic way that post-war progressives interacted with the government, have become very focused on procedural justice, about suing the government. It's oftentimes about how to tell the government no, how to open up opportunities to veto what the government is doing, to slow it down, to stop it for review. And that's been the default for much of progressive politics. And that's not to say that's been entirely a bad thing either. In fact, that's often made things better, safer, cleaner. It's not just a bad orientation. But the authors of the book are concerned that this has slowed us down so much that liberalism no longer knows how to build. If we look at the consumer goods sector, things are getting cheaper and more available, and there's more products, and there's a huge amount of innovation on the stuff that you can just buy in the market. But of the things that are necessary for human life or that interact with the government, progress has slowed down much further. Things are getting more expensive. If you look at things like healthcare or housing, you'll notice that there's not typically enough to go around. It's very expensive. If you have to pay for it yourself for your healthcare and you don't actually have healthcare through your work, you are feeling the pinch, and you're going to feel the pinch next year too as the subsidies potentially vanish under the ACA. And they're asking why. Why can we no longer build things and have big visions and develop the technology that we need to address climate change, to make sure everyone is housed, and to create good lives for people who live in the United States and elsewhere? We need innovation to do this, and policies that, even if well-intentioned, slow down innovation may put us in a position where we are causing net harm to the country, to the people who would otherwise live near us. Were they able to have housing that would accommodate them? We're making things worse by behaving in this way. So they're very focused on how do we reform science, the funding of science, how to support YIMBYism, yes in my backyard, rather than not in my backyard, NIMBYism. How do we make it so that the default is to build rather than the default is no, slow down, it's really expensive. Like one of the funny stories that I've heard a number of times working in climate stuff for a decade is that sometimes people will look to places like China and say, wow, they were able to build so much high-speed rail so quickly. Why can't we do that? And the reason that they're able to do that and we can't is that there's much less opportunity for a democratic opposition to projects like that, where having strong property rights in the United States and having strong abilities through NEPA and various environmental policies that allow for communities to request or demand environmental review before projects that might have an environmental impact take place can slow things down and cost a huge amount of money. And Paul Kingsnorth, oh man, where do you even start with Paul? So Paul was, for a long time, an environmental activist. He used to write books and articles that were focused on the globalization. So when globalization was happening in previous decades, there was a strong left-wing movement against it. I think of things like the 1999 battle in Seattle, World Trade Organization protests. I think of things like the Zapatistas in Mexico. I think of movements that are protesting their induction into global trade and capitalist economics. So Paul's research and writing was around that. And he ended up writing an essay called Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist, where he sort of gave up on his previous work and orientation and no longer thought it was suitable. And the things that he was positioning himself against were no longer radical enough for the moment. He began asking stranger and deeper questions about technology, about capitalism. One of the things that capitalism is often praised for by people who really like it is, in fact, how transformative it is. Both capitalists and anti-capitalists will look to someone like Joseph Schumpeter and his concept of creative destruction as either a good or a bad thing. What was unique about capitalism as being a system that rewards endless churn. Like the goal is to transform what has existed previously. It will destroy certain ways of being or certain companies or certain ways of life, but that creates open ground for new and better things to emerge and to grow in its place. And he noted that one of the risks of capitalism's amazing transformative potential is that it transforms many of the social functions that it needs for stability to keep itself going. A modern example of this is something like we've replaced a lot of our in-person hang time with digital time. So instead of hanging out with friends like you might do, like go watch Stranger Things or something like that, you're no longer playing Dungeons and Dragons in someone's basement. You're texting on your bed alone while the TV's on. Rather than going and doing something, we're communicating with a lot of people at the same time on Instagram or some sort of platform. But these platforms don't make us feel better. It helps in some cases where you're able to connect with people that you otherwise might not see. If you're a member of a marginalized community, there's ways to find fellow feeling and community outside of where you actually live geographically. So there are some upsides to it. But if you zoom out a little bit from that and just take a general view, these platforms ate our in-person social time that was really important for learning how to be in social relationships with others, how to regulate emotions. And these platforms being profit motivated, often they make money the longer that they keep users on their platform. And oftentimes the way that they do that is by generating and stoking and maintaining bad feelings, many of which are insecurity, anger, despair. And you'll just notice, like, think of how easy it is to get into an argument online versus in person. It's way harder to get into an argument in person when you see someone's face, when you can recognize their humanity. Online, that's way less present. It's the same thing too when you'll, I don't know if you're ever driving and someone will cut you off in the car or something, and it's way easier to just get angry without even seeing them. But if you were just walking on the street, the most you might do is go like, oh, that was kind of rude, and kind of grumble to yourself most of the time. And so the Schumpeterian way of understanding social media is that there's capitalist innovation that replaced in-person hangs with digital spaces and digital connections. And that has left us with much worse emotional regulation, social behavior, less connection, increased rates of depression and anxiety and other things that are correlated with high social media use, especially among young people. And this has undermined the stability of democracy in some cases, where people now are so alienated from one another and so angry that we can hardly even speak with one another at this point. The polarization is so intense and so intensely negative, I think because, at least in part, social media that came about within a capitalist democracy within the United States has ended up undermining capitalist democracy in the United States at the same time. Like the creative destruction ate itself. Of course, there are examples that are better than this too. Like you can point to the creative destruction of something like Kodak not seeing that digital photography was coming, not getting ahead of it, and is now a shell of its former self, while digital camera manufacturers and people who got ahead of that were able to survive and actually grow at Kodak's expense. And that's an example of creative destruction where unless you love 35 millimeter, you love filmmaking, you love you love emulsion, you love film photography, it was an improvement where there's so much more photography and it's so much more accessible and so much cheaper now as a result. That's creative destruction in a really good way. But if you're someone like Paul Kingsnorth, if you have a profit orientation, you can look at creative destruction and say, we used to go to the pub, we used to be a part of things, and now we're not. If you think about creative destruction for a profit, it represents probably less creativity and more just destruction. One of my favorite albums of all time is the Kinks' The Village Green Preservation Society, which is about a changing England in how the village green, like the town center, where there'd be a space for people to come together and exist, was already, even when this album was being written nearly, 50, 60 years ago, the new ways of doing things are not better. They're making us less happy. We feel like we are liberated, but the things that we're liberated from were the things that made us feel connected. We were penned in, but that container for us was actually socially useful. It was a useful thing for us to push against. But when it's replaced with nothing, that amount of absolute freedom that we're pushing towards is not necessarily great for human development or our spiritual needs or even what we evolve to be, even if we're only material beings on this planet. What we evolve to be is not supported by the new types of structures that we are now creating. And Paul Kingsnorth feels all of that. A lot of his writing and his speaking has been about the loss of mythology and how we used to have folk tales, and these came from a people who were settled in a place, who had a shared geographic and cultural syntax, and they were able to create powerful stories from our souls that told of this place and the people and taught important lessons. And that's something that is essentially vanishing now. He tells an anecdote about being at a campfire decades ago with a guitar being passed around with people from all around the world, being caught in this mind loop of, well, what is even an English folk song that I could bring here? I'm not even sure that I have one at hand. Why do my people not have folk songs that I can access? Everyone else seemingly has it. So the people who are less industrialized or less recently industrialized, they were able to pick up the guitar and just do this and share songs from their homeland in a way that the song might be, decades or hundreds of years old, and was beyond just commercial music that he could have shared. Like, I'm sure, Paul, I don't know if you're listening, but if someone handed you a guitar, could you play Wonderwall or something? Like that would be, given the time period when this happened, I would think Britpop might have been something that was near at hand, but that's different from being a folk song. That's different from being something that came from a people. Like, do you need to lean on the Gallagher brothers for like British heritage in this way? I think you would see that as a failure of your culture to deliver meaningful cultural messaging that is communicative about what it means to be an Englishman. This is sort of the tinier part, the lesser part of Kingsnorth's primitivism, which a lot of people can say this. In fact, what I just described can be independent of right or left politics. There are plenty of conservatives who could make a very similar claim about the loss of heritage, about how bigness is not necessarily good for us, that we miss small town Main Street America. I feel like a lot of country music is about these themes. Like, this is not a right or a left thing. Left has their small is beautiful environmentalism that I associate with someone like Amory Lovins or Wendell Berry. Kingsnorth goes further than this, though. Kingsnorth quotes people like Ray Kurzweil, famous for the singularity is near, a visionary at Google and has been for a long time, or Kevin Kelly's What Technology Wants. Paul is looking at creative destruction and the growth of technology and where we are now and likely to be soon, and he's aghast. The promise of technology, especially among people who consider themselves technologists, the underlying messaging of technological development, especially at this point in its development, it carries an ideology all its own. If you're able to listen to it, I think you could probably hear it. Put your ear to the ground. I bet you can hear it. And you can even hear people who are big futurists, technologists, people who are trying to scheme out the next decade or decades. These books have a feel of prophecy to them. They're making predictions about technology. And technology, or at least certain kinds of it, have an inbuilt ideology. Technology is not a neutral thing. Technology communicates values. It's creating a world that is increasingly under human control, more customization, more ability to control our bodies, to live longer, and potentially to never die. Ray Kurzweil is very famous for thinking about the singularity, which is the moment when humans are no longer the top species on Earth, when technology collectively is more intelligent than humans are, and especially if it's able to reinforce and grow its own intelligence without human input. And once that happens, the pecking order has changed. And whether we are meant not to die either corporeally, where we have various longevity technologies that can reverse aging, that can keep human bodies alive much longer, or whether we actually leave our bodies behind and become pure spirit, uploaded into some sort of digital infrastructure, is an open question. And it depends on who you ask. And that opens up so many important questions about what it means to be human. Are we meant to die? What does it mean if we exist in perpetuity? Is that a wise thing to do? And I don't think we're going to solve that here, but I think it's safe to say that for Paul Kingsnorth, the answer is yes, humans should still die. This attempt to put ourselves in a position to not do this is taking that role from God. We aren't actually meant to have this much power. It's too much power for humans to exercise responsibly. And what does that mean for us when the future may be even less in our control than we thought? What's funny about it is that Paul quotes several people working on AI who see their work as shepherding a new being into existence. He quotes them saying, ushering a new entity into existence. And AI researchers seeing their role as creating a future that may intentionally be superseding humans. I've been thinking a lot about this too. Like so many other people, the discourse called and I answered. I read Eliezer Yudkowsky's new book, If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Will Die, about what it means to create super intelligent AI, which is that same thing I just mentioned, where AI that is capable of improving itself without human input. And once that is built, if it is not kept in a controlled environment under human control, the prediction in that book is that it will escape, it will find ways to hide where it is, and will make moves that will be extremely threatening and potentially calamitous for human civilization on Earth because its values will be so different from our own that it will optimize for things that are indifferent to human well-being. And this is of enormous civilizational, earth-wide concern. And it's really hard for me to watch the pace of technological development and not feel that there's some part of that that is just true. Right now, it very much feels that the people working in AI are all rushing towards how do we make bigger and better models, get more GPUs co-located for the most amount of compute that we can have. Governments, I'm sure, are doing the same things. Why would they not be? The military advantages of having better artificial intelligence are self-evident. And you just have this obvious game theoretic arms race dynamic where someone's going to do it, whether they're doing it because they want to go from being a decabillionaire to a centibillionaire or be the world's first trillionaire. They're all trying to make sure they're up on all these advances and to stay ahead of these things. And what scares me about this is that if any one of them slows down, it's not like you can convince everyone to just walk away from this right now. There's too much money to be made. There's too much obvious advantage geopolitically, strategically to do that. And so it's likely a dynamic that will persist. And so it does feel like we are headed head on into a world that is increasingly dominated by AI, that will only increase in capacity. And this isn't necessarily technology that will make our lives better. It's mixed, right? Like, here's a more mundane example that's still really important. Think about the enabled emissions campaign that several former Microsoft employees launched against Microsoft, saying that the AI that Microsoft is developing and deploying will be good for climate because it will allow us increased compute that will help us with weather modeling, ways to become much more effective about energy usage and to learn more things and make scientific advances faster that will help us decarbonize on net. But at the same time, AI software at Microsoft and elsewhere is likely to be used to help fossil fuel companies locate and extract more oil and gas resources that will drive the same economic feedback loops that got us here in the first place. And one of the questions that faces anyone working in climate, and it's a really good one, is, are you willing to take definite emissions now for a theoretical reduction tomorrow? If you're a prophet, the answer is obviously no. If you're a wizard, the answer could potentially be yes. It could also be no, but it could also be yes. Because with wizards, any attempt to slow down technological development could lead to the bad consequences of our previous behavior catching up to us, even though the new technology will create new problems that tomorrow's technology will have to address tomorrow. Wow, that's a confusing sentence. And you can even hear this in places like, maybe the most extreme example of this that I've seen recently is Peter Thiel's Antichrist lectures that he's been giving, talking about how the safetyism of someone like Greta Thunberg positions her potentially as a candidate of being the Antichrist, because slowing down technological development is literally a death sentence for humanity, or literally something that will cause world-ending, literal apocalyptic transformation such that it fits into Christian eschatology. And so Kingsnorth is looking at all of these dynamics and thinking that we've just made a wrong turn as a species. We are serving technology, it's not serving us. Spiritually, it's pointing us in a position that gets away from the world's oldest religious and spiritual traditions that were meant to deal with limits. We've lost sight of limits here, and we're so focused on what we could do that we weren't asking what we should do. All right, sneak some Jeff Goldblum, Jurassic Park in there. We've lost sense of limits. And in fact, we really do not like limits as a species, or maybe it's just as a culture. I'm not sure exactly. I don't know if it's humans. I don't know if it's my acculturation within the United States and like a broadly Euro-American tradition. But we don't like it. Unfortunately, it might be the thing that is necessary because we are now at a point where our technology is capable of influencing the entire globe. We've been here for a while now. We've lost sight of what our relationship with technology should be. Something a prophet could easily do is point to our relationship with technology as one of the Tower of Babel. We're building a tower to the heavens out of hubris, out of a desire to flex our engineering know-how. We built this edifice that competes with God. And will God allow us to continue? Will our own hubris bring us down and force us to acknowledge our limits? And the scale of this is so late. The kinds of catastrophes that would cause us to have a serious conversation with limits, whether it was desired or forced upon us by circumstance, they're all terrible, terrible things. I just watched the new Catherine Bigelow, A House of Dynamite film about what it would be like with a nuclear attack on the United States. Fascinating movie. I also read the Annie Jacobson book that is also great, Nuclear War Scenario. Or if you take the warnings of Eliezer Yudkowsky seriously about superintelligent AI, these are things that if the threshold were crossed, it might not be possible to cross back to it again. We might not be able to have a conversation about technology's role at that point. It reminds me of the Albert Einstein quote. It's something like, World War III will be fought with thermonuclear warheads, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Like anything that happens at this point, at this level, that would cause us to confront our relationship with technology and human teleology and where we're going and why, I think is likely to be a catastrophic event in this kind of way. That being said, you can also listen to all of this and think, I think this Kingsnorth guy is way off. I'm much more on the side of Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. Those far off risks, we've managed them successfully for nearly a century at this point. We're going to be okay. We're going to get a handle on climate change. Even Bill Gates thinks we're going to get a handle on climate change. You don't need to worry nearly so much. I think that's good to keep in mind. My personal take on this is that if I'm able to relax a little bit, if I take catastrophic risk out of the equation and I'm not thinking about super intelligent AI or anything like that, I think the orientation that I prefer is something that's much more abundance oriented. I like the wizard orientation. It's too late to just walk away from climate change. We need to figure out how to make carbon removal scale. We need to decarbonize. We got to make that stuff work. If we don't do that, then I think we're in for a much worse time on net. We might need more technology now to save the problems of technology from yesterday, and we'll need technology tomorrow to save the problems that we create now. As I said earlier, that is the wizard way of doing things, and there's a logic to it. Like, it makes a lot of sense, and I'm sympathetic to that. I get really worried, though, if the technology that we're building now to help us with the problems of today and of yesterday are things like AI, where there's a race, and this race might be racing towards something uncontrollable, something beyond humans, something that changes our ontology, something that changes our teleology, something that changes our relationship to ourselves and the planet and what it means to be human and what it means to be on Earth. That makes it much harder for me to accept the abundance mentality to be a wizard. If you rate the possibility of the game theory of superintelligent AI development seriously, I think it makes the abundance way of thinking much harder to swallow. Because if we have to choose, I think we'd all rather live in Hobbiton than live in a world that AI has determined that humans do not serve its purpose. We're too slow and too clunky and too weird, and therefore AI should be focused on maximizing energy production and therefore covers every square inch of Earth's surface and solar panels and nuclear facilities to power increasing intelligence and ability to absorb data. That's... I know that sounds farcical and sounds really far out, but that's part of the theory that people like Yudkowsky have staked their reputation on, at great personal risk. It's not easy being brave enough to think that we are headed towards calamity that is being overlooked by everyone else. That's a really difficult position to be in. I'm sure it alienated them professionally. Being an AI researcher is probably the most lucrative thing you can do right now if you were in software. I've heard of deals. I've seen deals that have been ridiculous. The competition for AI researchers is so high. that you have to take it seriously if Yudkowsky and Nate Suarez think it's going to be that bad. I think it's important to take them seriously. People who say what they perceive to be the truth at great personal cost, that's something that you should listen to. And if we have to choose, then let's go to Hobbiton with Paul Kingsnorth. Let's go to the Village Pub. Let's play chess. Let's talk. Let's recreate new folk songs that teach us about what it means to be connected to a specific place and not be deracinated individuals floating around the planet to a bunch of cities that all look the same, creating some sort of urban culture that is so deeply unsatisfying to our more tribal minds. Oh, it's funny doing a podcast like this where I expected to spend much more time on abundance and to split this kind of evenly. Unfortunately, so much more of this needed to take place just to explain some of the ways that Paul Kingsnorth, Yudkowsky, and granted, they're pretty different people, but there's some overlap there, to explain how these things fit together, to explain the profit mindset, at least in a couple of these cases, is much harder. I think the fact that I naturally did it this way points to just how familiar the wizard mentality is. I'm just assuming that you already kind of know that because our culture teaches us that tomorrow will be better than today. Technology will help us. We're going to continue to develop. We're Americans. We're optimistic people. We build things. If we are no longer building things to the same extent, it's because something is blocking us that we have to unblock. And that is not the case for everyone. So perhaps more time needed to be spent with the prophet. Links to all of these books are in the show notes. There's going to be a lot of references from this one. I would definitely recommend checking out the show notes. I did not do the little promotional thing at the beginning, but hey, if you like this show, if you thought it was cool, open up your podcast app before this episode is out. Give it a great rating, 5 stars on Spotify. That's really, really hugely helpful, and it's so easy to do. Please do it. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, 5 stars and a little review that says how much you like this show. That's so appreciated by me. You can also become a paid subscriber for $5 a month. And when you do that, you get bonus content. It gets rid of all the ads that I don't read myself, and you will support the show in a way that defrays some of the costs of making this show, keeping my attention on reading books and talking about them. Thanks for listening. I hope you will agree with me now that when it comes to environmentalism, it's wizards and prophets all the way down. I think that's really, really obvious at this point. You'll see it everywhere. If you haven't already seen it everywhere, you're going to see it now. Thanks for listening. Have a great one.